Chapter 9. No event of any importance occurred to our travelers in the course of their aerial voyage. They were too well provided with all kinds of necessities to have any occasion to rest by the way, and in an incredibly short space of time they were hovering over Egypt. Different, however, how different from Egypt of the 19th century, was a fertile country which now lay like a map beneath our feet. Improvement had turned her gigantic steps towards its once desert plains. Commerce had waved her magic wand, and towns and cities, manufactories and canals spread in all directions. No more did the Nile overflow its banks. 1,000 channels were cut to receive its waters. No longer did the moving sands of the desert rise in mighty waves, threaten to overwhelm the wayworn traveler. Macadamized turnpike roads supplied their place with their post chaises, with anti-attrition wheels, bellowed at the rate of 15 miles an hour. Steamboats glided down the canals, and furnaces raised their smoky heads amidst groves of palm trees, whilst iron railways intersected orange groves and plantations of dates and pomegranates which might be seen bordering excavations intended for coal pits. Colonies of English and Americans peopled traveled the country, and produced a population that swarmed like bees over the land, and surpassed even in numbers the wondrous throngs of the ancient Mizoram race, while industry and science changed desolation into plenty, and had converted barren plains into fertile kingdoms. Amidst all these revolutions, however, the pyramids still raised their gigantic forms, towering to the sky, unchangeable, grand, simple, and immovable, fit symbols for the majestic nature they were intended to represent, and seemed to look down with contempt upon the ephemeral structures with they were surrounded, as though they would have said, had utterance been permitted to them, "O vaunting nothings of the day, respect our dignity and sink into your original obscurity, for know that we alone are monarchs of the plains." Indestructible, however, as they proved themselves, even their granite sides had not been able entirely to resist the corroding influence of the smoke with which they were now surrounded, and a slight crumble announced the first outward sympathy of decay. Still, however, though blackened and disfigured, they shone stupendous monuments of former greatness, and Edric and his tutor gazed upon them with an awe for some moments deprived them of utterance. The doctor, however, was too fond of reasoning ever long to remain willingly silent. After surveying them for a few minutes, broke forth as follows: "What noble piles, what majesty and grandeur they display in their formation, and yet what dignified simplicity! Can the imagination of man conceive anything more sublime than the thoughts that they have stood thus frowning in the awful magnificence, perhaps since the very creation of the world, without equals, without even competition? Mocking the feeble efforts of man to divine their origins, and seeing generation after generation pass away, whilst they still remain immutable, and involved in the same deep and unfathomable mystery as the past." "It is very strange," observed Edric, "that in this age of speculation and discovery, nothing certain should be known concerning them." "It is," replied the doctor, "but the thick, mysterious veil that has rested upon them for so many ages seems not intended to be removed by mortal hands. They remind us of the simple inscription upon the temple of the goddess Isis at Sais: 'I am whatever was, whatever is, and whatever shall be, but no mortal has as yet presumed to rise the veil that covers me.'" "Your quotation is apt, Doctor," resumed Edric, "for both relate to nature. Indeed, nature appears to be the deity which the ancient Egyptians worshipped, under all the various forms in which she presents herself, and their strange and animal deities were but reverenced in their symbols. It was nature whom they worshipped at Isis. It was nature that they typified in the pyramids, and the good taste of the Egyptians made them prefer the simple, the majestic, and the sublime in those works which they destined to last for ages. Formerly, from the immensity of their population and the high state of their civilization, labor was so divided, and consequently so lightened, that the multitudes were enabled to exist from the soil. These persons devoted themselves to study, became initiati, and either enrolled themselves amongst the priesthood or passed their lives in making themselves masters of the most obscene sciences. The consequences were natural. They followed up the ramifications of creation to their own natural source. They penetrated into the most profound secrets of nature, and traced all of the wonders in her works. Aware, however, of the taste of the vulgar for anything above their comprehension, and of the natural craving of the human mind for mystery, they wrapped their discoveries that they made deep in the impenetrable veil, concealed awful and sublime significations under the meanest and most disgusting images.
"You're right," said the doctor, "in your observations upon the religion of the ancient Egyptians, but it does not appear to me that the pyramids were erected by them."
"What? I suppose you draw your conclusions from the want of hieroglyphics in their principal chambers, and from the Heterodotus says that they're having been erected by a shepherd? You think they were the work of the Pallic race?"
"No, though I will allow much may be said in favor of the hypothesis, particularly of Herodotus, since the kings under whom they were erected ordered all the Egyptian temples to be closed, which we know the shepherd and Pallic sovereign did. But I cannot imagine that an ignorant Goth-like race of shepherds, men accustomed to live in tents in the open air, and possessed no talents but for war, were capable of constructing such immense piles. No, the pyramids required a gigantic contraptions, highly cultivated minds, and unwearied perseverance, all qualities quite incapable of the warlike wandering race. No, I do not think that the Pali were capable of imagining such structures, much less of constructing them. I think they were the work of evil spirits."
"Evil spirits?" exclaimed Edric.
"Yes," returned the doctor. "We are told that the evil spirits, after their expulsion from paradise, were under the command of Sultan, or Solomon Jim ben Jim, as he was called by the Arabic writers, but who is supposed to have been quite the same as Cheops, and that he employed them in his vast work."
"I do not know what the analysis entomologist can draw the name of Cheops from that. But supposing the fact to be correct that they are designated as the same person, I think it only proves more strongly my hypothesis. From the Pali came Mount Caucasus, where the evil spirits were said to have been enchained. And if Cheops was a Pali king, it is possible that the Egyptians might poetically call their conquerors evil spirits."
"That is a good idea, Edric, though I do not think it is by any means certain that Cheops was a Pallic king. However, we shall soon be able to see his tomb and judge for ourselves, for we now have approached near enough to the pyramids to descend. For what a smoke and what noise! It is enough to rouse the mummies from their slumbers before their appointed time, without the aid of galvanism." "Have you opened the valves, Edric? Oh yes, I perceive we are getting lower. We will not lose a moment before we visit the pyramid. What a crowd of brutes are assembled to witness our arrival. They stare as though they have never seen a balloon before. Egypt is certainly a fine country, but the inhabitants are a century behind us in civilization."
An immense crowd had gathered together to witness the descent of our travelers, and they did indeed stand staring, lost in stupid astonishment at the strange sight that presented itself. For though the Egyptian people had occasionally seen balloons, they had never before seen one made of Indian rubber. The odd figure of the doctor, too, amused them exceedingly, as he sat wrapped up in the most undignified manner in an asbestos cloak, his bob wig pushed a little on one side from the heat of the weather, and the warmth of his arguments, his round, red, oily face attempting to look solemn, and his little, fat, pudgy figure trying to assume the air of majesty. The Egyptians were amazingly struck with this apparition, and being, like most colonists, somewhat conceited and not very ceremonious in their manners, they looked at him with a few moments of silence, and then burst into moderate fits of laughter. The doctor was exceedingly indignant at this rude reception, and rising, shook his fist at them in anger, a maneuver, however, that only redoubled the mirth of the unpolished Egyptians, whose peals of laughter now became so tremendous that they actually shook the skies, and occasioned a most unpleasant vibration in the balloon. Edric, who was almost as much annoyed as the doctor, had yet sufficient self-command to continue calmly making preparations for his descent, and without taking the least notice of the crowd below, he screwed the top upon the propeller vapor bottle. He let the inflammable air escape from the balloon, which rapidly collapsed as they approached the earth, and throwing out their patient spring grappling irons, they caught one of the lower stones of the Great Pyramid, and in a few moments the car in which our travelers were sitting was safely moored at a convenient distance from the earth for them to alight. Edric now loosed the descending ladder and reverently assisted the doctor, who was encumbered with his long cloak, to reach terra firma in safety, amidst the bustle and exclamations of the crowd who thronged about them, expressing their wonder and astonishment audibly in broad English. "Where the deuce did this spring from?" they cried. "The car would load a wagon."
"And what has gone with the balloon?" said another. "It has clean vanished." "Well, I never saw such a thing in my life before," exclaimed the third. "They must think they come from the moon."
"Hush, hush!" cried an old gentleman bustling among them, who seemed to as one having authority. "What's the matter? What's the matter?"
"We're strangers."
"We're strangers, sir," said Edric, advancing and addressing him. "We come here to see the wonders of your country, and we wish to explore the pyramids. But the reception we have met with—" "Say no more, say no more," interrupted the worthy voice, for such as he was. "Get about your business, you rapscallions, or I'll read you the riot act. Here, Gregory, call out the postcomitus, and set a guard of constables to keep watch over this gentleman's balloon, whilst they go to explore the pyramids. Eh, but where's this balloon? I don't see it. I hope neither the gentleman has it in his pockets," laughing in his own wit. "No, sir," replied Eric, smiling. "Through feat which might easily be accomplished, for that is our balloon." He pointed at the Cachahula bottle, which shrunk to its original dimensions. "Very strange, that," said the justice. Very curious indeed. Well, gentlemen, if you wish to proceed immediately, you'll want a guide, of course. These cottages at the foot of the pyramids are all inhabited by guides, who get their living by showing the sights. They are sad roads, most of them, but I can recommend one to you who is a very honest man. Here, Samuel," knocking against a small door. "Samuel, I say." Samuel made his appearance in the guise of a tall, raw-boned, stupid-looking fellow with a pair of immensely broad, sleeping shoulders, which looked as though he could have relieved Alice occasionally of his burden, without much trouble to himself. Coming forth from his hut in an awkward, shambling pace, he scratched his head and demanded what his honor pleased to what. "You must show these gentlemen the pyramids," said the justice. "Aye, that will be with pleasure," returned Samuel. "I've got my living by showing them these 50 years, boy and man, and I think I know every crink and cranny of them, though I'm old now and somewhat lame, so walk this way, gentlemen." "But
"We're very much obliged to you, sir,"
said the doctor, bowing to the justice. He was, in fact, one of those good-natured, busy, bustling men, who are always better pleased to transact with any other person's business than their own, and are never so happy as when a new arrival gives them the opportunity of showing off their consequence. Indeed, there was a pleasure in showing wonders to a stranger that only those who have little else to occupy their minds can properly estimate. A man of this kind feels his self-love gratified by the superiority of his local knowledge gives him over a stranger, and as it is, perhaps, the only chance he will ever have of showing superiority, they must be unreasonable to blame him for making the most of it. Justice Fremantle was accordingly exceedingly delighted with travelers who seemed disposed to submit implicitly to his dictation, and he returned the most gracious reply to the doctor's thanks. Don't mention it, my dear sir," he said. "I'm never so happy as when I can make myself useful. Is there anything else I can do for you? You may command me, I assure you, and you may depend upon it. No injury shall be done to your luggage whilst you are away."
"What a very civil, obliging, good-natured old gentleman," said the doctor as they walked towards the entrance to the pyramids. "I declare he almost reconciles me to this country, though I own I thought at first the people were the greatest brutes I'd ever met with."
"Which pyramid does your honor wish to see?" asked the guide.
"The one that contains the tomb of Cheop's, man,"
cried the doctor solemnly, who, encumbered with his long cloak and loaded with his walking stick and galvanic battery, had some difficulty in getting on. "Would your honor let me carry that pole in the bag?" said the man. "You'd get on surprisingly better deal if you would."
"Avaunt, wretch!" exclaimed the doctor. "Nor offer to touch thy profane fingers the mortal instruments of science."
The man stared, but fell back, and the whole party walked on in perfect silence. In the meantime, Edric, who had walked on before his companions, completely lost in meditation. A crowd of conflicting thoughts rushed through his mind, and now, when he found himself at the very goal of his wishes, the daring nature of the purpose he had long so entertained seemed to strive for him at the first time, as he trembled at the consequences that might attend their complexion and desires. With his arms folded on his breast, he stood gazing at the pyramids, whilst the ideas wandered uncontrolled through the boundless regions of space. "And what am I?" he thought. "Weak, feeble worm that I am, who dared to seek to penetrate the awful secrets of my Creator? Why should I wish to restore animation to a body now resting in the quiet of the tomb? What right have I to renew the struggles, the pains, the cares, and anxieties of mortal life? How can I tell the fearful effects that may be produced by the gratification of my unearthly longing? May I not revive the creature whose weakness may involve mankind in misery? And what if my experiment should fail? If the moment when I expect my rash wishes to be completed, the hand of the almighty vengeance should strike me to earth and heap molten fire at my brain to punish my presumption?" The sound of human voices, as the doctor and the guide approached, grated harshly on the nerves of Edric, already overstrained by the awful nature of the thoughts in which he had been indulging, and he turned away involuntarily to escape the interruption he dreaded, quite forgetting for a moment from whom the sounds most probably proceeded. "Lord have mercy on us," said the guide. "I declare that gentleman looks as if he were beside himself. And see here, if he hasn't walked right into the entrance of the pyramid without seeing it. Sir, sir!" hallooed he. Excessively annoyed, but recalled to his collection by these shouts, Edric returned.
"These pyramids are wonderful piles," said the doctor as he stumbled forward to meet him. "I really had no adequate conception of the enormity of their size. They did not even look half so large at the distance as they are now."
"Immense massive seldom do," replied Edric, compelling himself with difficulty to speak.
"True," returned the doctor. "The simplicity and uniformity of their figure deceives the eyes, and it is only when we approach them that we feel the stupendous magnitude of our own insignificance."
"They give an amazing idea of the grandeur of the ancient kings of Egypt," he said, without exactly knowing why he was saying it. "Their palaces must have been superb, if there had been such mausoleums."
"How absurdly you reason, Edric!"
replied the doctor peevishly, for, being annoyed with his burthens and his cloak, he was not in a humor to bear contradiction.
"I thought we'd settled the question before. In the first place, I think it is very doubtful whether Egyptians had anything to do with the building of these monuments, and if they had, I think they were meant for temples, not mausoleums. And in the next place, even if they were intended for tombs, their greatness affords no argument for the splendor of the surrounding palaces, as the Egyptians were celebrated for the superior of their burying places and for the immense sums they expended upon them. Indeed, you know, ancient writers say they went so far as to call the houses of the living only inns, and they considered tombs everlasting habitations. A circumstance, by the way, that strongly corroborates my hypothesis, at least as far as the opinions go, as it seems to imply both soul and body were designed to remain there."
They had now entered the pyramid, and were proceeding with infinite difficulty along a low, dark, narrow passage.
"Observe, Edric," said the doctor, "how the difficulty and obscurity of these winding passages confirm my opinion. You know, the religion of the ancient Egyptians, like that of the ancient Hindus, was one of penances and personal privations, and granting to be the case, what can now be more simple, that the passages of the Eternity were had to traverse before they reached Adytum, should be painful and difficult to access. Besides this, as you know, the bones of a bull, no doubt those of the god Apis, were found in the sarcophagus of a second pyramid. It seems probable that it is sacred to his worship in the vicinity to the Nile, which was indispensable to the temples of Apis, as, when it was time for him to die, he was drowned in its waters, confirms the fact. Indeed, I am only surprised that any human being possessing a grain of common sense can entertain a single doubt upon the subject.
How do you account for the tomb we're about to visit being placed in the pyramid, if you think they were designed for a temple? Said Eric.
This question is futile, said the doctor. A strange fancy prevailed in former times that burying the dead in consecrated places, particularly in temples intended to divine worship, would scare away the evil spirits, and to practice actuality prevailed in England even as late as the 19th or 20th century. Indeed, it was not till after the country had been almost depopulated by the dreadful infectious disease that prevailed about 2 centuries ago that the law was passed to prevent the interment of the dead in London, and that those previously buried in and were near the chambers were exhumed and placed in cemeteries beyond its walls.
Edric did not reply, for in fact his ideas were so absorbed by the solemn object before him that it was painful for him to speak, and the doctor's ill-timed reasoning created such an irritation on his nerves that he found it required the utmost exertion of his self-command to endure it patiently. The passage they were traveling now became higher and wider, shelving off occasionally into chambers or recesses on each side, till they approached a kind of vestibule, in the center of which yawned a deep, dark, gloomy-looking cavity like a well.
"We must descend down that shaft," said the guard, "and that will lead us to the tomb of King Cheops. But as the road is dark and rather dangerous, we had better each of us take a torch."
As he spoke, he drew some torches from a niche where they had been deposited, and began to illuminate them from his own. The red glare of the torches flashed fearfully on the massive walls of the pyramid, throwing part of the enormous masses into deep shadow, as they rose in solemn and sublime dignity around, and seemed frowning upon the presumptuous mortals that had dared to invade their recesses, whilst the deep pit beneath their feet seemed to yawn wide and engulf it into an abyss. Edric's heart beat thick. It throbbed till even he fancied the pulsations inaudible, and a strange, mysterious thrilling of anxiety, mingled with a wild, undefinable delight, ran through his frame. A few short hours, and his wishes would be gratified, or set to rest forever. The doctor and the guide had already begun to descend, and their figures seemed changed and unearthly in the gleams of the torches fell upon them. Edric gazed for a moment, then followed with feelings worked up almost to a frenzy by the overexcitement of his nerves, was a hollow sound that re-echoed on the walls as they struck against them in their descent thrilled through the whole frame. No one spoke, and after proceeding for some time along the narrow passage, or rather ledge, formed on the sides of the cavity, which gradually shelved downwards, the guide suddenly stopped, touching a secret spring. A solid block of granite slowly detached itself from the wall, and rising majestically like a portcullis of an ancient fortress, showed the entrance to the dark and dreary cave. The guide advanced, followed by our travelers, into a gloomy, vaulted apartment, where long vistas of ponderous arches stretched on every side, till their termination was lost in darkness, and the grave a feeling of immensity and obscurity to the scene.
"I will wait here," said the guide, "and here, if you please, you had better leave your torches. That avenue will lead you to the tomb."
The travelers obeyed, and the guide, placing himself in the recess of the wall, extinguished all the torches except one, which he shrouded us to leave the travelers in total darkness. Nothing could be now more terrific than their sensation, mirrored in the recesses of the tomb, involved in darkness, and their bosoms throbbing with hopes that they scarcely dared avow even to themselves. With faltering steps they proceeded slowly along the path the guide had pointed out, shuddering even at the hollow echo of their own footsteps, which alone broke the solemn silence that reigned throughout the fearful regions of terror and the tomb. Suddenly a vivid light flashed upon them, and as they advanced they found it proceeded from torches placed in the hands of 2 colossal figures, who, placed in sitting posture, seemed guarding an enormous pool, surmounted with the image of a fox, the constant guardian of the Egyptian tomb. The immense dimensions and air of grandeur repose of the colossi had something in it very imposing, and our travelers felt the sensation of awe creep over them as they gazed upon the calm, unmoved figures, so striking emblems of that immutable nature which they were doubtless placed there to imply. It was feelings of indescribable solemnity that the doctor and Edric passed through this majestic portal and found themselves in an apartment gloomily illuminated by the light shed faintly from an inner chamber through the ponderous brazen gates, beautifully wrought. The lights thus feebly emitted showed them that the room in which they stood was dedicated to Typhon, the evil spirit, as his fierce and savage types covered the wall, and images of the symbols, the crocodile and the dragon, were placed beneath the shadow of the brazen gates, and dimly seen by the imperfect light, seemed startling to life, and grimly to forbid the farther advance of intruders. Our travelers shuddered, and opened with a trembling hand the ponderous gates. They entered the tomb of Cheops. In the center of the chamber stood a superb, highly ornamented sarcophagus of alabaster, beautifully wrought. Over his hung lamp with wondrous marksmanship supplied by a potent mixture, so as to burn for ages unconsumed, thus awfully lighting up with perpetual flame the solemn mansions of the dead, and typifying life eternal even in the silent tomb. Around the room on marble benches were ranged mummies, simply tried, apparently those of slaves, and close to the sarcophagus was placed one contained in a case, which the doctor approached to examine. This was supposed to be that of Saurus, the confidant and prime minister of Cheops. The chest that enclosed his body was splendidly ornamented with embossed with gilt leather, whilst the parts not otherwise covered were stained with red and green, curiously blended, and of a vivid brightness. The mighty Cheop, Jupiter of the Egyptians, spread its widely extended wings over the head, grasping in its monstrous claws a ring, the emblem of eternity, whilst below, the vulture forms of Re proclaimed the deceased voltarity of the powerful deity, and on the sides were innumerable hieroglyphs. The doctor removed the lid and shuddered at the crimson tinge of the everlasting lamp fell upon the hideous, distorted features of thus suddenly exhibited to view. The spectral light, indeed, added unspeakable horror to the scene, and its peculiar blaze threw such a wild and demonic expression on the dark lines and ghastly lineaments of the mummy, that even the doctor felt his spirits depressed, and a supernatural dread crept over his mind as he gazed upon them. In the meantime, Edric had stood gazing upon the sarcophagus of Cheops, the sides of which were beautifully sculptured with groups of figures which, from the peculiar light thrown upon them, seemed to possess all the force and reality of life. On one side was represented an armed and youthful warrior beating off his arms with a beautiful female, on whom he gazed with the most passionate fondness. He was pursued by a crowd of people and soldiers who seemed rending the air with vehement expressions against his violence, and endeavoring in vain to arrest his progress, whilst in the background appeared an old man, who was tearing his hair and wringing his hands in effectual rage against the ravisher. On the other side presented the same old man, wrestling with the youthful warrior, who had just overpowered and stabbed him, the helpless victim raising his withered hands and failing eyes to heaven as he fell, as though in implore vengeance upon his murderer, whilst the crimson current was fast ebbing from his bosom. The dying look and agony of the old man were forcibly depicted, whilst upon the features of the youthful warrior glowed the fury of a demon. The sarcophagus was supported by the lion, an emblem of royalty, and the symbol of the solar god Horus. Above it all sat the majestic hawk of Osiris, gazing upwards and unmindful of the supple crocodile of Typhon that, crouching near its feet, was about to seize its breast in its enormous jaws. Neither of the travelers had yet spoken, for it seemed like sacrilege to disturb the awful stillness that prevailed, even by a whisper. Indeed, the solemn aspect of the chamber filled through every nerve, and they moved slowly, gliding along with noiseless steps, as though they feared prematurely to break the slumbers of the mighty dead it contained. They gazed, however, with deep but undefinable interest upon the sculpture's mysteries on the tomb of Cheops, vainly endeavoring to decipher their meaning, whilst, as they found their efforts useless, the secret voice seemed to whisper in their bosoms. And shall finite creatures like these, who cannot even explain the signification of objects presented before their eyes, presume to dive into the mysteries of their Creator's will? Learn wisdom by this omen, nor seek again to explore secrets above your comprehension. Retire whilst it is yet time. Soon it will be too late. Edric stared at his own thoughts in fearful warning. Soon it would be too late, rang his ears, and a fearful presentiment of evil weighed heavily upon his soul. He turned to look on the doctor, but he had already seized the lid of the sarcophagus and, with a daring hand, removed it from its place, displaying the fearful light royal from that lay beneath. For a moment, both Edric and the doctor paused, not daring to survey it, but when they did, they both uttered an involuntary cry of astonishment, as the stern but handsome features of the mummy met their eyes, for both instantly recognized the sculptured warrior and his traits. Yes, it was indeed the same, but the fierce expression of fiery and ungoverned passions depicted upon his countenance of the marble figure had settled down to a calm, vindictive, and concentrated hatred upon that of the mummy prototype in the tomb. Awful indeed was the gloom that sat upon the brow, and the bitter sardonic smile that curled those haughty lips. All was perfect, as though life still animated the form before them, and it had only reclined there to seek a short repose. The dark eyebrows and thick raven hair which hung upon its forehead, and the snow-white teeth, those seen though the half-open lips, forbade the idea of death, whilst the fiend-like expression of the features made Edric shudder, and he recollected the purpose that brought him to the tomb, and he trembled at the thought of awakening such a fearful being from the torpor of the grave to all with the renewed energies of life.
"Let us go,"
whispered the doctor to his pupil in a low, deep, unearthly tone, fearfully different from his usual cheerful voice. Edric started at the sound, foreseeing the last sad warning of his bitter genius before he abandoned her forever. The die, however, was cast, and it was too late to recede. Indeed, Edric felt worked up to a frenzy of the overwrought feelings of the moment. He seized the machine and resolutely advanced towards the sarcophagus, whilst the doctor gazed upon him with a horror that deprived him of either speech or emotion. Innumerable folds of red and white linen, disposed that alternatively swathed the gigantic but well-proportioned limbs of the royal mummy, and upon his breast lay a piece of metal, shining like silver, and stamped with the figure of the winged globe. Edric attempted to remove this, but recoiled in horror when he found it bend beneath his fingers with unnatural softness, whilst in the flickering light of the lamp fell upon the face of the mummy. He fancied its stern features relaxed into a ghastly laugh of scornful mockery. Worked up to desperation, he applied the wires of the battery and put the apparatus in motion, whilst a demonic laugh of derision appeared to ring in his ears, and surrounding mummies seemed starting from their places, as dancing in unearthly merriment. Thunder now roared in tremendous peals through the pyramids, shaking their enormous masses to the foundation, and vivid flashes of light darted around in quick succession. Edric stood aghast amidst the fearful convulsion of nature. A horrid creeping seemed to run through his every vein, every nerve feeling as though drawn from extremity, and wrapped in icy chillness around his heart. Still, he stood immovable, and gazing intently on the mummy, whose eyes had opened with a shock, and were now fixed on those of Edric, shining with supernatural luster. In vain Edric tried to rouse himself, and in vain turned away from the withering glance. The mummy's eyes still pursued him with their ghastly brightness. They seemed to possess a fabled fascination of those of a rattlesnake, and though he shrunk from their gaze, they still glared horribly upon him. Edric's senses swam, yet he could not move from the spot. He remained fixed, chained, and immovable, his eyes still riveted upon the mummy, and every thought absorbed in horror. Another fearful peal of thunder now rolled in the lengthened vibrations above his head, and the mummy rose slowly, his eyes still fixed upon those of Edric from his marble tomb. The thunder pealed louder and louder. Yells and groans seemed to mingle with its roar. The sepulchral lamp flared with redoubled fierceness, flashing its rays in quick succession and with vivid brightness, whilst by the horrid and uncertain glare, Edric saw the mummy stretch out his withered hand as though to seize him. He saw it rise gradually. He heard the dry, bony fingers rattle as he drew them forth. He felt its tremendous grip. Human nature could bear no more. His senses were rapidly deserting him. He felt, however, the fixated, steadfast eyes of Cheop still glowing upon his fallen orbs, as the lamp gave a sudden flash, and then all was darkness. The brazen gates now shut with a fearful clang, and Edric, uttering a shriek of horror, fell senseless upon the ground, whilst a shrill cry of anguish rang vividly through the marble vaults, till it re-echoed seemed like the yell of demons rejoining the merciful, fearful mockery. How long he lay in this state he knew not, but when he reopened his eyes for a moment, he fancied that all had passed a dream. As his senses returned, however, he recollected where he was, and shuddered to find himself yet in that place of horrors. All now was dark, except the faint gleam shone feebly through the half-open gates. These ponderous portals slowly unclosed, and the form of a man, wrapped in a large cloak and bearing a torch, entered, peering around as though he advanced, as though half afraid to proceed. Edric's feelings were too highly wrought to bear any fresh horrors, and he shrieked in agony as the figure approached. The sound of his voice subdued the terrors of the intruder, and the doctor, for it was he, shouted with joy as he rushed forward to embrace him.
Edric, thank God he is alive! Exclaimed he. Edric, my beloved Edric, for God's sake, let us leave this den of horrors! Come, come!
Reassured by his tutor's voice, Edric arose, taking one hasty, shuddering glance around as the light gleamed on the sarcophagus. He hurried out of the tomb. Neither he nor the doctor spoke as they passed through the vestibule, where the colossal figures sat still in awful majesty. Indeed, as their torches were extinguished, their gigantic forms seemed more terrific than before, from the wave of instant light thrown upon them. Edric shuddered as he looked, and hurried on with hasty strides to the place where they had left the guide, whom they found kneeling in a corner, hiding his face with his hands and roaring out, "O Lord, defend us! Heaven have mercy upon us! Lord, have mercy upon us! Heaven have mercy upon us!"
He has been in that state for more than an hour, said the doctor mournfully, for after I came to myself again I tried to rouse him, but all to no purpose.
Then you also fainted, said Edric, with difficulty compelling himself to speak.
Why,
resumed with the doctor with some hesitation,
I don't know what you can exactly call it fainting, but the fact was that when I saw you touch the plate upon the mummy's breast and start back, looking horribly frightened, I thought I'd better call for assistance, so I ran for that purpose, and somehow or other I fell down and lay insensible, or I don't know how long. When I came to myself, however, I tried to rouse the guide, and when I found I could not, I came to seek you. But now that we are both recovered, I really don't know what is to become of us, for the fellow will never be able to show us the way out, and I'm not sure I can know the road.
Let us try to find it at any rate, said Eric gently.
Oh, for God's sake, take me too, screamed the guide. If you have any mercy, don't leave me in this fearful place.
Then take the light then, and lead the way, said Edric. The guide obeyed, shaking every limb, and every now and then casting a terrible look behind, whilst the quivering flame of the torch betrayed the unsteadiness of his trembling hand that bore it. In the manner they proceeded, starting for every sound, and frightened even at their own shadows, without daring to stop till they reached the plain.
Thank God,
cried the doctor, the moment they stepped out of the pyramid, while looking round, gasping for breath, and inhaling the fresh air with rapture. Thank God, repeated Edric and the guide as they walked rapidly towards the place where they had left the balloon. When arrived there, however, they looked for it in vain, and fancying themselves under the influence of illusion, they rubbed their eyes and looked again, but without success.
Dear me, this is very strange, said the doctor. This is certainly the place, and yet, where can it be?
Where indeed, repeated Eric. The horrors and uncountable incidents environ us at every step. I'm not naturally timid, yet. Ah! Screamed the doctor, as he trembled over a man lying with his face upon the ground. Oh! Groaned he, as Edric and the guide with difficulty raised him.
Oh, to heaven, I was safe at home again in my comfortable little study, indulging in pleasing anticipations which I might find anything in the world but pleasing in reality.